Good morning. We're going to start the meeting now. Legal Eagles. Noreen and Josh. Thank you. So we are reconvening the meeting of the Board of Psychology. I was asked to mention a couple of things. Number one, the reason we're all looking at computer screens is because all of the documents that are related to this meeting are on computer screens. We're not here surfing the web and killing time. Number two, to the extent that you have a cell phone with you, if you could put it on silence, that would be great. Thank you very much in that regard. Okay, so we're going to resume. Well, let me talk about what's going to happen today a little bit. We'll take the quorum after that. And that is that today we are going to need to go back into closed session because we have got disciplinary matters. So we're going to go from about 9 to 10:30. We'll break at that point. We're going to go back into closed session. We'll probably be in closed session. We'll be in closed session until at least noon, if not 1 o'clock. So that may mean we have a working lunch, and we will resume at 1 o'clock. We still have some matters that we need to discuss. So that being said, I believe, would you please take the quorum? Okay, Sharice. Ms. Burns?
Coy Badu?
Yeah, I'm here.
Bernal?
Aye.
Kasuga?
Here.
Erickson?
Here.
Fu?
Here.
Horn?
Here.
Jones?
Present.
Phillips?
Present.
You have a quorum.
Okay. We've got a full house. So the first item on the agenda is public comments for items not on the agenda. How many people would like to speak to public comment for agenda items? 2? Okay, well, okay, great. So we're going to restrict you to about 5 minutes each because we need to get through our agenda today, but hopefully that will give you sufficient time to be able to share your thoughts with us. Again, I remind the board that for public comment on items not on the agenda that cannot be discussed by the board except to the extent that we decide to add something to the agenda. Okay, so who would like to go first? You got the timer.
And when you go up to the microphone, what you'll do is you'll press the button that has the little person's face on it with the little vibrations coming out.
If I survive that, I'll survive telling you what's on my mind.
There you, oh, you had it? You had it?
I had it.
Yeah, just push, there you go.
Wow, technology. Hi, my name is Sandy Ross, and you surprised me so early, so quickly to speak to you. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to bring to your attention the issue of child safety in child custody cases. It's an ugly issue that usually you could actually feel the energy in the room shift because the child custody system, all of the systems, it's just so turbulent. And I understand that from the APA's perspective that that's where they receive the most complaints on psychologists. I get that. And I understand that a lot of the complaints, I don't know if it's because of the volume, I really don't know what it is fully, that they're not addressed. I'm aware of one complaint that's over 3 years old, where the children in a particular custody case, their lives will probably be changed for a long time. So I've asked the board that focus on the complaints. But most importantly, why I wanted to speak to the board today is to ask that you would become aware above and beyond the conflict and the craziness of the system, what happens in these cases, and actually look at some of the, and forgive me if you already are, but look at some of the research and the real child safety issues that exist. I'm wearing this band. I went to a memorial service for a little boy last month who was murdered in a child custody case by his dad. Why is that important to you? because one of the psychologists, the evaluator, would not listen or look at evidence in support of what was happening, did not address the mom's concerns, and within 9 days of that evaluation, the child was murdered. It wasn't just the psychologist, it was there's this dynamic of professionals that it's so difficult to get it right. So I plead with the board to I don't know how the board receives its education. I just did a presentation 2 days ago with the mother of this child and a retired judge to Intergovernmental Council of Los Angeles County, and they're going to set up a task force to address child safety and child custody, because there's been, I think it's 631 children murdered by a parent. Actually, I believe it's 632, at least 632 children murdered by a parent. I had 631, but I found out 2 nights ago another child is added to that list. That is a list that I'm sure the Center of Judicial Excellence will mention and tell you how they accumulated that data. There's a research study that was funded by the NIJ, DV Leap, an organization founded by a clinical law professor out of George Washington University. It involves over 4,000 child custody cases and the outcomes. They looked at certain criteria, and I won't go through all of that, but I just want to point out to you, there's a concept, or it was tried to be a diagnosis, called parental alienation. And in her study, and I know we all know that, it's about parents turning children away from the other parent. I know that happens, but what's happening is that concept has taken on a life of its own. So in this study, what it shows is that when parental alienation is alleged, it's usually occurring in cases where child abuse is alleged. So it's almost, one party says there's child abuse, especially child sexual abuse. Typically the mother says that based on the nature of what it is. Then the automatic response is, this is alienation. This study, just sampling 240 cases, shows that when there's child sexual abuse, when there's alienation, alienation is winning. In other words, even if they're credited both in the system, alienation seems more important than child abuse. Go.
We've reached our time, so
Oh, all right, so really quick, 68% of the time when a mom alleges child sexual abuse, primary custody is switched to the father. How many children are sexually abused by the time they're 18? 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 8 or 9 boys. That number is frightening. So I just ask if you would please get educated on what's happening at the ground level. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. I did want to mention, which I had earlier, to the extent that you're tempted to do so, mentioning particular licensees of the board can have a prejudicial impact on our ability to fully enforce the law. So I just would caution you against using someone's name.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jamie Gay. Thank you for having us here today. And my discussion that I wanted to focus on was a couple subjects which they all root from reunification programs here in California and across the nation, and the practice of these programs of reunifying. And they have inserted themselves in the family law court system. And these programs all follow the same basic protocols, and that's threats when they treat these children that are sent and transported, handcuffed, flown across the nation, and most of the time here based in California. These procedures happen with several families. And unfortunately, through my research, I haven't found one successful case. And this dates back to 15 to 17 years ago from Texas when they first originated. A lot of these programs work out of hotels or unlicensed facilities, as in homes, and they're popping up everywhere. And as soon as they pop up, they close down. And we're unsure why this is happening. And licenses, names are changing of businesses, and we'd like some form of protocol or some task force in your organization to start monitoring this. The children that are sent to these programs, these are going in there without any diagnosis, and when they're sent to without diagnosis, they're further abused through this threat. There's threat therapy, they're deprived of food, they're screamed and yelled at, and the list goes on. We've addressed this issue with you before. I've spoke before about 2 years ago, and this is still occurring at this time. The issues at hand is where I'm really concerned is about the complaint process. I know that there's families across the nation that have filed complaints, and meanwhile, I know you have a task force with the investigation team working on this, and I appreciate you guys doing that. But meanwhile, while these complaints have been in for a couple years, they're still operating. They're still opening new businesses on the East Coast, closing them down. They're not legit licensed business, following county protocol, state licensing procedures, and we're finding families that are being sent there. And these programs charge astronomical fees. And if there's a parent that's been removed from the situation, in order for that parent to be brought back in for their reintegration, they are charged $8,000 a day just to meet with these PhDs. And a lot of the time, these families can't even afford it. And it's a discrimination on social economic status for these families, because if they can't afford it, then they are never able to be reintegrated back into their children's lives. I'd like to request that there is some tight regulation and accountability to these reunification programs. A lot of these reunification programs are ran by facilitators that have suspended license still. Some have a high school diploma, and they are handing out certifications to become life coaches under these programs, and they have no qualifications under the Board of Psychology or the Board of Behavioral Sciences. And it's a great concern, because they are sending these children as fast as they can out of the doors of the family law courts straight into these programs in hotels, and there's not one successful case. I've been researching for 2 years. These children come out with post-traumatic trauma. They come out now going in there with straight A's and having great grades, to having self-harm, committing suicide. These kids went in there because they didn't want to see one other parent because of abuse. That is substantiated evidence. They're forced to go back. They're never to see that protective parent till they're 18. And if they are reintegrated with that parent, the abusive parent has received full custody. This does affect me personally. And I know other families that are going through this at this time. I beg for your immediate attention. And if there's investigations going on with these PhDs, is there any way that we can implement a freeze on their practice? If there's enough evidence of harm, and children have rights, don't they? Children have rights to harm. CPS has to follow this, correct? There's state laws.
I hate to cut you off in the midst of what you're
Okay.
talking about, but you're reached the time limit, so if you could just make a concluding
so
remark.
I beg that you take quick attention to this. I know that there's a lot of complaints pending, and meanwhile, these programs are still up and operating, and they're not following the Board of Psychology License Procedure and Ethics, the APA guidelines. They're all in violation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I see a familiar face.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and board members. My name is Kathleen Russell, Executive Director of the Center for Judicial Excellence. Here to just, I guess, remind you that there was a very thorough complaint filed 3 years ago this month about an individual who this body has disciplined in the past, who is harming multiple families through these reunification programs, flying children, not just from around the U.S., but from Canada as well, to California hotel rooms to threaten them. And there's nothing, as Jamie pointed out, showing that these programs work or are effective. And I'm sure this body is aware of, and I know that you've discussed it because we were in attendance at your policy committee, the legislation dealing with gay conversion therapy that's in the legislature right now. This is no different. We're talking about adolescents who are being coerced and threatened by PhD psychologists to and threaten that they'll be sent away and they'll never see their parent that's raised them, that their primary attachment figure, as psychologists, I think you know what that means, that they will never see them again. And these kids are reporting cutting themselves, throwing up during the procedures, and this licensee or former licensee of yours is reported this in his own reports about his treatment of these children, that they're throwing up and threatening suicide. So this is happening. Your licensees are running these programs. NBC is about to start a whole series of television investigative coverage of this crisis. The Washington Post magazine did a cover story, May 2017, which we brought to your attention. Still, nothing has been done. And I understand it's at the DOI, right? The Department of Investigations is understaffed and that you have problems with timeline. But you also have prioritization guidelines, which the DCA has put forward. And I have heard very little discussion in the year and a half of attending your board meetings about prioritizing complaints that involve serious harm to a patient. That is the #1 criteria for an urgent complaint. And these folks running these camps have multiple complaints sitting in your agency that have gone unacted on. So we've talked to the Senate Business and Professions Committee. We know that you had a recent meeting with the BBS and Senator Hill's staff, and we continue to work with that committee to ensure that these boards understand the seriousness of what's happening. This is not, some hysterical parents who are, borderline or what have you, just upset because they lost custody of their children. These are kids who continue to report being physically and sexually abused after these PhD psychologists are threatening them and harming them. So this is very much in your bailiwick. These are your licensees. I know when we first brought this up to you a year and a half ago, you said this wasn't, weren't sure why we were here, and this wasn't your jurisdiction, and yet these are very much your licensees that are harming people. And if for some reason there is a gap in jurisdiction around you're only able to deal with licensees in their private practice, let us know that, and perhaps you can work with us to co-author some legislation to close the gap, because this is a huge problem and it's a money-making venture, and as we all know, money is what makes the world go round, and these psychologists are making $50,000 for a weekend, and this is not involving the court. There's no court appointment of these psychologists. They are being appointed by parents, unconnected to the court. So this very much falls in your bailiwick, and I would just mention there's a mother in Canada who in the last month committed suicide because her kids were sent to Family Bridges and she was denied contact with them. And kids are so devastated they can't even speak right now. So we're going to continue to come here, and we would love to partner with you to be part of the solution. And I realize that you have limitations in what you can do, and hope that we can address this in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further public comment for items not on the agenda? Thank you for your remarks. We're going to then move on to item number 12, which is the minutes of the past meeting. Dr. Horn.
Surprise. First of all, I want to thank staff for, because I sent in some early edits, and I really appreciate your including them and your thoroughness of including them. So thanks very much. Line 167. The last part is in parentheses. Probably I should have made that as a comment rather than, and put it off to the side when I was making my suggestions.
That's already been addressed.
Okay.
So it is with boards and bureaus, and it's been changed into the language without the parentheses in question.
Okay. Thank you. Line 216, I just have a question about this. Dr. Phillips stated that the above items have been pushed back from the agenda. What does that mean? What does push back from the agenda mean?
I think what it's referring to is that we continued it on the agenda of the Enforcement Committee because we hadn't been able to get to it in the prior meeting. Is that, I think that's accurate. So maybe we
should say continued.
Continued on the agenda?
Yeah.
Okay.
And let me see. I think that is it. Again, I want to thank y'all, but let me just make sure. Line 805. And I know this is just inclusion of the brochure and how it's been altered, but we have psychologists, registered psychologists, psych interns, and psych assistants, but there's another group of psychologists, if we're listing all of these folks, and they are postdocs. And I would put like interns or postdocs together for the brochure. So I know this isn't, but that's where I'm catching it, so.
Can we save that edit for when we get to the brochure?
Oh, okay.
If you
I'll
wouldn't
just
mind,
wait.
that way.
No, I don't mind
We
at
can
all,
make sure
because
and cover it.
I just saw it here and so wanted to kind of say that, but I know it was just from the minutes, but I think that's it. Wait a minute. Oh yeah, this is another one from the booklet, so, okay. Okay, that's it.
So just as a point of clarification, and I'm glad that came up, we will be addressing the booklet, professional therapy never includes sex or never includes sexual behavior later on the agenda. So to the extent that you have specific comments, this is how it reflects what state it was in by the end of the meeting. So, okay.
Line 1489. Just a clarification, I think it suggests that both Dr. Kasuga and I are co-chairs of the task force, and I believe Dr. Kasuga is the chair of the task force, and I'm a member of it. So just clarifying that sentence there.
How would you like the language to read?
With Mr. Fu as a task force member?
Yeah.
Chaired by Dr. Kasuga.
Okay, I think we can capture that.
I defer to staff's wisdom on how they want to phrase that.
I had inclusion, because I want to make sure we capture the nature of the conversation in 1522 about the election of officers. I think what's missing, and I will start off by saying, like Dr. Horn said, I do appreciate, I think the minutes were really, really good. I do think there should be some inclusion about the discussion about the election of officers, and that I inquired about the process by which board members would indicate their interest in serving. And I also mentioned, so I will read the language I said, but I think I really wanted to capture the question about the process, the question about, that I asked Ms. Marks about the legality of board members talking outside the meeting, and I also wanted to capture what Ms. Marks said about possibly having a nominations committee. So I think that those are good things for us to look at for future, if that's something we want to do. So this is the language I propose, and I can give you the sheet after I read it, staff. Ms. Jones inquired about the process of board members indicating interest to serve. She shared that the board previously discussed efforts to have licensed and public members represented in board leadership. She asked Ms. Marks about the legality of board members advocating for support outside of meetings, and Ms. Marks explained that board should be mindful of violations of the Open Meeting Act. Ms. Marks also provided information on other boards creating nomination committee processes. So if you would like to take this, that's what I'd like to include.
Any further comments on the minutes?
Can we move to adopt the minutes as amended with the edits by Dr. Horn, myself, and Vice President Jones?
Any further board? Does somebody want to second the motion? Okay. Is there any further board discussion? Is there any public comment on the minutes? Okay. Ms. Burns, you want to, oh, okay, we've switched off. Ms. Chung?
Akwebedu?
Yes.
Brunel?
Yes.
Kasuga?
Aye.
Erickson?
Aye.
Fu?
Aye.
Horn?
Aye.
Jones?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
I don't know why I turned my microphone off. The next item on the agenda is the budget report. Item number 13, so I believe we'll be hearing from Ms. Burns.
Yes, good morning. Sorry, I couldn't see the light. So this is our budget report. We don't have anything new to report. We are currently still expecting to get our general fund loan repayment this year. We do not have any word otherwise. The budget will be signed, of course, in June, so we will get final information at that time and be monitoring the budget bills until then. The rest of the report is for your information. We are still having some problems with the fiscal system and getting the kind of detailed but categorized reporting that we're used to. So a lot of these have real numbers, but maybe not all in the right categories and everything. So the budget office is still not concerned about us. We're still in a good spot. Everything looks great. But of course, we are still whittling down, so we are expecting that loan repayment, so.
And just to clarify, if I understand correctly, the budget office, because fiscal is not fully operational at this point, is to some extent having to kind of pencil out some of the data and
They
estimate some
are.
of the numbers?
So essentially, they can see everything, every little tiny detail, but they can't quite get reports to run into the categories that you normally would see. So they can still see everything that's been expended, but maybe not chunk it out into a digestible pattern instead of tons of lines of code with dollar amounts on them. So we do still have budget numbers. It's just really hard to kind of give you detailed, categorized money. So
Great.
yeah.
Are there any board comments or questions about the budget report? Seeing none, no action is necessary on the budget report. So we'll move on to item number 14, the enforcement report. Ms. Monterrubio.
Good morning. So the enforcement report is item number 14. And what I have included is the actual report itself with a few attachments, the performance measures, the overview of enforcement activity and legend, the complaint prioritization guidelines, and we'll start with the report. So the board is looking to hire an enforcement technician. Interviews will be scheduled in the next few weeks. The OT opens complaints for the enforcement unit and provides office support to the enforcement staff. We concluded our expert training in Oakland on April 13th of this year. The experts were trained in writing analysis, working with the board's investigative unit, and testifying at administrative hearings. Board staff and the Office of the Attorney General and the board's investigative unit assisted with the training. Since July 1st of 2017, we have received 926 complaints, and all complaints are opened and assigned to an enforcement analyst. During the February meeting, there was discussion on how the board prioritizes complaints. So for reference, I have attached the prioritization checklist. I do apologize. What I noticed is that is an older version. I have a newer version here, and I'll make copies at the first break and hand that out. But it does give a breakdown of how they're categorized and which cases get referred over to the Division of Investigation. Since July 1st of 2017, the board has issued 46 enforcement citations, and again, citations are issued for minor violations. Since July 1st, the board has referred 55 cases to the Office of the Attorney General for formal discipline, and the board tracks the timeline of its investigation process through the performance measures, which illustrates the specific phases of cases review from start to finish. So for cases that result in disciplinary action against a licensee, the board refers to performance measure number 4. And I know that we've had lengthy discussions about us not being able to meet performance measure 4. The target date is 540. We typically are around 800, which is where we're at right now. So we've broke down how PM4 is basically considered. And so PM4A is intake only, and that is when the board receives a complaint and when the complaint is assigned to an analyst. PM4B is investigations only, and that is when the enforcement analyst begins their initial desk review and refers the case to the field for formal investigation by a sworn peace officer. PM4C is the pre-AG transmittal, and that's when the enforcement analyst receives the case back from the field investigator and sends it over to the AG's office for discipline. And PM4D is post-AG transmittal, and so that is when the AG accepts the case from board staff, and this includes drafting the accusation, setting the matter for hearing, and settling through a hearing or through a stipulated settlement. So for example, as of September of 2017, the average time it took the process for a complaint to be filed and then through its investigation and discipline process was 800 days. So we're well over the 540. But I wanted to kind of break down a little bit more of the PM4 for mainly you, Dr. Horn. You had a request about that. So intake only, on average, it takes 9 days to open a new case and assign to an enforcement analyst. The investigation only phase, which is PM4B, takes 485 days. So that's when it's referred over to the Division of Investigation. PM4C is when it's returned back to us. We prepare it to send to the AG's office. That takes 2 days. And PM4D, again, is post-AG transmittal, and that's an average of 303 days. So that's when it leaves our office. We refer it to the AG's office for formal discipline. And again, they're preparing the accusation, setting the matter for hearing. So PM4A, which is intake, which is what board staff is responsible for, is 9 days. And PM4C, again, what board staff is responsible for, is 2 days. So once it leaves our office, we're able to check with DFI and with the AG's office for status updates, but it's pretty much out of our control at that point. But a couple of things that I wanted to point out. while not comprehensive, there's a list that represents some of the most common factors that may affect the age of a case, and that includes the size and complexity of a case under review by the board, the caseload of the field investigation unit assigned to that case, scheduling conflicts when interviewing complainants, subjects, and witnesses, availability of an expert reviewer to complete the final review of a case, subpoena enforcement that sometimes becomes necessary when a subject is resistant, and scheduling conflicts when setting the matter for administrative hearing. And I also provided a list of some of the agencies that are involved when a case goes through investigation and through the disciplinary stage, and that is obviously the board, Department of Consumer Affairs legal staff, D of I, and the HQIU unit, Office of the Attorney General, Office of Administrative Hearings, and Office of the District Attorney. Our probation program, we currently have 49 probationers, and of those 49, 18 are out of compliance. Being out of compliance can result in a citation and fine or further disciplinary action through the Office of the Attorney General. And again, I have attached for your review is the enforcement performance measures, as well as the prioritization checklist, the overview of enforcement activity, and the legend that was requested at our February meeting. So if you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them now.
I just had a comment, Ms. Monterrubio, this is so helpful, because I feel like you have walked through a lot of this information before, but even breaking it out into the PM4 process is super helpful, so thank you so very much. And also, thank you for including this, the prioritization guidelines, because I think that was probably the question I was trying to ask at the end of the meeting, that I didn't use the right term. This is super, super helpful, so thank you so very much, staff.
Sure. And again, I do apologize that there seems to be an older version that was included, but I'll make copies at the first break and provide the newest version that we have available. And in regards to the PM4, we're happy to dissect that for all of you for every board report. So at least gives a breakdown of what board staff is responsible for, as well as the outside agencies that we deal with.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Ms. Jones said. I think this is very helpful to me. It helps us see kind of what's going on. And I'm also seeing from this that a lot of times just due process itself takes, periods of time. Sure. It just doesn't necessarily move as quickly as sometimes we want it to. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, that's it. Good. Thanks.
Is there any further board comment? Michael, I thought your finger was poised.
And I do just want to, what Dr. Horn just said made me think of something. I think this might be helpful too for us to put in materials we share with our legislative visits for next year, because I definitely feel like it is important to understand the entire context we work within. And I think that as they might hear information or constituent complaints about certain things, I think it would be helpful for them to know what the process is looking like. So this way it's formatted is so beautifully, visually simple to understand.
Okay, we absolutely can include that.
PM4B, which is the time that it takes for investigation. Oh, thank you. I thought I'd gotten it. PM4B, which is the length of the investigation, has that number varied since we've gone from using HQIU to D of I?
When we were with HQIU, I can't remember the exact number. It has significantly reduced since we've been with the Division of Investigation, and we just hired our own in-house special investigator.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part.
Oh, I'm sorry. Since we've been with D of I, yes. HQIU was very, very understaffed, and so we have now been working mainly with Division of Investigation, and so those numbers have reduced significantly. But again, I want to remind the board that we do have our own in-house special investigator who can work basically any case for us that needs to be expedited. The only type of cases I probably wouldn't refer to someone in-house is if maybe it was in regards to an arrest or a conviction, and we'd want a sworn peace officer to be out to interview that individual. But other than that, our special investigator can handle pretty much any case that we need to investigate.
Just for purposes of clarity, there are cases that still have to go to HQIU, is that correct?
Typically, we use them for sexual misconduct cases, so they work vertical enforcement. So the Attorney General's office is basically part of that investigation at the very beginning. But the Division of Investigation can take those cases on as well. They do not work with the AG's office, so it's really on a case-by-case basis. But if we were to refer over to HQIU, it would be for sexual misconduct only.
And when you talk about sexual misconduct, you're talking about sexual misconduct on the part of, or the allegations of sexual misconduct on the part of the psychologist?
Correct.
Dr. Erickson?
Wanted to echo what other board members have already stated. It's really helpful the way you've presented this, so thank you for that. A couple of questions, well, one main question. Of course, it's clear that PM4B and D are where most of the time is expended. Do you happen to know whether other licensing boards have the same general kind of time frame in those areas? This is not something unique to the Board of Psychology, I'm assuming.
No, I'm not sure how long it takes other boards in regards to their investigations and working with the AG's office. What I do know is that many of the boards within the department have a hard time reaching the PM4 target date of 540. You can go to DCA's website and look at any board's PM performance measures, and I believe that most of us are having a difficult time reaching the 540. But I don't know specifically what other boards are dealing with in regards to transmitting time for the AG's office and referring cases over for investigations.
Okay, thank you.
Any further board comment? Oh, Saron.
Go ahead.
Mr. Fu.
Thank you. Just in reference to Vice President Jones' comment about the presentation for legislative visits, I think it also might be helpful to lay out or explain why there are so many participants involved in a short way. Because I think at a layperson's glance will be like, why would we include the 7 or 8 folks you've listed?
Okay.
And sometimes as staff members in the legislature may not understand why there's so many different participants involved, and if it can be done succinctly, I defer to the committee obviously, but that might be helpful.
Okay.
And then just for clarification, does the board have any ability to, let me rephrase the question. In terms of hiring for HQIU and DOI, the board doesn't have any ability to do that, correct?
No.
And that's outside of our jurisdiction?
Correct.
And then how many enforcement staff do we have on our,
There
approximately?
are currently 8 of us,
So-
including myself.
Essentially, 896 complaints, 8 staff members, so each staff member is investigating more than 100 complaints?
On average, the enforcement analysts are currently working about 90 to 110 cases each.
And on the PM4 measure, that means that the turnaround is about 10 days per person then?
Correct.
That's impressive, thank you.
So I'm not sure whether this is the appropriate place to bring it up. It's not about the report, but I think it's about enforcement. So I just want to, for a future agenda, bring it up. Would that be okay? And that is just a follow-up on what's happening with CANRA. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll figure it out. Any further board comment? Public comment? Ms. Russell?
Yeah, sure. Yes, I would love to see a copy of the lovely presentation that's being discussed. There's actually no public copies of the enforcement report today. I know you've been pretty good about that in the past. It's not over there, just agendas are with no enforcement report.
There's a binder.
What, the yellow? Okay, there's one left then. Okay, great. And then a concern that I have, and I know there's been board discussion about this in the past, is where the multiple complaint licensees fall into the prioritization scheme of things. And I don't know how the board handles that, but I would request maybe at a future meeting. I know that different analysts are looking at different complaints about the same licensee. That's been discussed in the past. But if you have a licensee that has 5 or 8 complaints against them, and I know the enforcement manager brought that up at a prior meeting, the number, I think there were over 50 complaints that were about 5 individuals. And so are those getting fast-tracked in any way? And if not, why not? Is there some rule around not putting them to the front of the line? But it seems to me there are certain licensees that are really quite predatory in their practices, and those should be escalated in the prioritization guidelines. So I just put that out there. Thanks.
Can I just say something about that?
Actually, I'd like to give Ms. Montevideo a chance to respond to that.
Oh, okay.
So,
It's in our packet. It's in our packet.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So we did at a meeting, I believe the last time that we were in Berkeley, talked about. Sure. I think at our Berkeley meeting, we talked about multiple complaints being filed against one particular licensee. So what happens typically is if we have a complaint, we check the enforcement history on every single licensee. And if we see that there's another case that's currently opened, we will have the same analyst work both of those cases so that we can refer both of them over to the Division of Investigation. But we look at the entire enforcement history. So if somebody has multiple complaints, but those complaints, let's say, were closed several years ago, that doesn't affect the current case that we're looking at. We also look at the allegations that were made in those prior complaints and the allegations that are before us today. So we do prioritize those complaints. We look at, again, old complaints that are open and other analysts are working, and we combine those. We don't expedite those cases just because we have 2 complaints. They could be completely different allegations. So it's really on a kind of a case-by-case basis that we look at those and determine how we're going to proceed.
I just want to, if you get the packet that the public has, y'all will see in here just priority level and complaint category. And under urgent, one of the things that says highest priority are multiple complaints against an individual. So.
Well, it's multiple complaints of fraud.
Oh yeah, multiple complaints of fraud. Never mind.
Ms. Bernal?
I was just reminding you to turn on your mic.
I think, just for clarification, I was able to find, this is a public document that's available on our website, the enforcement report. So thank you for making that available to the public. I found it fairly easily online, so thank you.
Sure.
Further public comment?
Hi. When the complaint is child abuse by the psychologist, are these complaints moved up in priority?
When the allegation is child abuse by a psychologist?
Yes.
So I'll hand out, again, the prioritization checklist. And the first category is acts of serious patient consumer harm, great bodily injury, or death. So again, we prioritize every complaint according to this chart here.
Okay.
So,
Also, if the psychologist works for the court, do they have immunity under the license?
no, we can investigate any complaint that is submitted to the board that falls within our jurisdiction. So we receive complaints against child custody evaluators that allege bias, and we investigate those complaints.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Further public comment? Ms. Lindercrow, or Dr. Lindercrow, I should say?
Good morning. Dr. Joe Lindercrow, I'm the CEO of the California Psychological Association. I really have a question. I was listening to the conversation, and several times some of you have referred to your legislative visits. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? And am I understanding that you, or the staff, whoever is doing those visits, is making this a priority to talk to legislators about? I'm trying to figure out where the pressure points are for this. I know, and this has come up in the past, and there are many reasons why this lengthy time is a problem, both in terms of our colleagues here who are making their comments, but also in terms of psychologists who are waiting for the dispensation of their case. And it can really seem huge, very, very long. And so it is a difficult situation for many reasons. So rather than just kind of saying it's, what can we do? It's the DOJ's problem, you know, or they don't have enough people or whatever. How is the board, or is the board addressing this in an active way, kind of up the line? I'm just curious about that.
So let me start by answering the question, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Phillips. I was referring to, and we'll get to it in the agenda, I think you were a part of the Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting where we reported back out what happened in our February meetings with legislators. And what we have done in the past, staff has prepared like 2-pager of what was going on. That was the only comment that was made about this kind of information. I think it's helpful to talk about where we were at. And so there was no other visit being referenced there. It really was that, and I know that we don't have it as a separate item on the agenda, but in terms of when I get to that part of the agenda, I can give a report back out what happened at the committee meeting, because we did go into detail, and we actually last meeting shared with, as a hand carry, just the documents that were distributed to legislators, just the annual meeting with them to say what's happening at the board.
I see, so
and so there was
an
nothing else.
update meeting. So then my next question would be then, does the board, or can the board, isolate an issue like this and then advocate actively with whoever, and I'm not sure, I'm going to investigate myself, like where is the right place to advocate for changes in this? And can the board do that? Is it within your scope to do that?
I think to the extent, and we can still continue to think about it, but to the extent that we can, we've tried to impact the process to lessen the length of these things. It's frustrating to the board members. It's also frustrating to board staff sometimes that they have to wait around for such a long time. Part of the reason we moved from HQIU for the majority of our cases to D of I was because we felt that they could be more responsive to our cases, and that in turn has cut down on the number of days that it's taken for the investigations to be completed on average. In addition, we're meeting on a regular basis with Ms. DeCastro. I'm not sure of her formal title, but she's with the Attorney General's office. I think she's over the Enforcement Division of the Attorney General's office, to kind of talk about whatever issues are coming up, whatever ways we can help to expedite the process. So we do try to, as much as possible, impact this process in a way that we can lessen the time. The tension with licensees is between wanting to have it resolved quickly, but also wanting to respect their due process rights.
Of course.
So that's always a delicate tension in terms of things, and we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be heard in those processes. We also want to make sure we can move as quickly as possible under the circumstances.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to add anything to that, Ms. Monterrubio?
No.
Dr. Phillips, could I just clarify something that Ms. Monterrubio responded to the last commenter about immunity, and Ms. Monterrubio's comment would be going to any immunity with respect to the license, not any kind of civil or any other kind of immunity.
Hi, I just have a quick follow-up question now that I have a copy of the complaint prioritization guidelines, which are very helpful to see. Could you just explain what an interim suspension order or a penal code section 23 request or other interim action is as described? And is there a way to get this memo, which is referenced here, which is dated December 15th, 2008? These are very interesting to me, and I'd just love to understand what these actions are. Thanks.
Sorry, I was just looking at the legend that we provided because I thought we included that information. No, but I can definitely add that because I think the legend is helpful to kind of break down the line-by-line item. So we can definitely add the ISO, the PC-23. Typically with an ISO, that means it's an interim suspension order. The licensee cannot practice. Even though we, the board, haven't taken discipline yet, there is an imminent need for an ISO. Maybe there's serious allegations out there, and so we've had an ISO, and the same thing with the PC-23. It's an order saying that they cannot practice.
In what context do those typically come up?
Typically in, well, an example of one that we just currently had, there was molestation charges against a licensee. So typically it's criminal, and the AG's office will work with the district attorney's office and request, I believe at that time, Joshua, you maybe could help out a little bit. I think at that time, the AG's office will work with the local DA.
That's right. Josh Tomplay, I'm a Deputy Attorney General and a liaison for the board. Penal Code Section 23 appearance is just a mechanism that allows our office to work with a district attorney's office by appearing in a superior court and asking for restrictions on a licensee's license when we have enough evidence of substantial danger posed to the public. So typically, very serious criminal charges are pending. We will try to appear at the bail hearing and say, in addition to any bail that may be imposed, we're asking for a total or partial restriction for the defendant's psychology license.
And just a refinement on what Mr. Tomplay is saying is that the restrictions on the practice, because the criminal court does not have any jurisdiction over the license, so sometimes it gets confusing because the license may show free and clear, yet there is a court order from the criminal court that restricts the practice in some, in part or in total.
So, quick question on the Penal Code 23 question. Issue that you just raised, where in our process does that fit in? So is it completely outside our process, or is it when the enforcement unit has forwarded the complaint over to the AG's office? How does that work?
That's a good question. We'll be giving a presentation this afternoon that'll make it clearer, but I'll just try quickly now. It's in the investigation phase, so it's just a supplemental stage there. If at the onset or at any point during the investigation things suddenly look very serious and we have enough evidence and the person's in criminal court, we can work with the criminal court to put those restrictions in place.
And I won't belabor since we're getting it, but real quickly, the board doesn't issue the penal. That's the criminal court makes that order. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
And just so I understand, the interim suspension order is something different than the penal code section we're referring to, I take it?
Yes, typically with the ISOs, which is the interim suspension order, we're going to do an 820 evaluation, so somebody may not be fit to practice, and as a result, we're going to issue the interim suspension order, and again, that's with the help of the Attorney General's office.
So maybe in cases where there's a question about the cognitive capacity of the psychologist or the physical capacity of the psychologist?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, I appreciate that clarification. Any further public comment?
It is for this gentleman here. Sorry. What is the substantial evidence? What would you determine the substantial evidence to file a complaint through your agency?
We'll be given a presentation on this afternoon, but to take disciplinary action against a licensee, we have to show clear and convincing evidence that they've engaged in conduct that warrants discipline. So that's our standard. It's a little bit lower than the criminal standard, which is beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's higher than the standard that you find in civil courts, which is just a preponderance of the evidence.
That has to do with the nature of a license as a fundamental property right?
Correct.
Okay. Any further comments from the board or the public?
I just wanted to thank both of you for preparing, and I look forward to this afternoon's presentation as well. And as for the public comment, please know, or the people that have spoken, we are taking this very seriously, and I just really appreciate everyone's work on this.
Okay, thank you very much.
I have one comment. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say thank you for that report. That helped a lot to see it broken out that way. And also, when I said educate the board, I mean by way of presentation of what happens in the field to drive these complaints. A presentation was done to that agency yesterday or 2 days ago, and they were shocked, even being so close to the system, to actually see what's happening on the ground level. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, that, I think, brings the enforcement report to a close. Now we have the Enforcement Committee report, which we may start now and have to continue over because we're going to be breaking at 10:30 to go back into closed session.
Let me, first of all, as the Enforcement Committee chairperson, thank you very much. Ms.
Lucille, you want to bring that a little closer?
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the preparation, Ms. Monterrubio, and staff. You all, I mean, you always do a good job, but this was exceptional as usual. As we move forward for the disciplinary guidelines, and it's in your packet. Can you hear me? It's in your packet. And it says the committee, so we're going to look at the committee meeting. We met in March, and as we met in March to review and to make the final proposed changes to our disciplinary guidelines. And you will find that information. It is in the packet that's on the table there for the public. And we would like to, the committee now wants to, and forgive me, I'm scrolling down to, yes. I'm scrolling down to where I need to be. So the committee also reviewed and we made recommended changes to the complaint forms, which is also in your packet. And we also, the acknowledgement letters and the closure letters. And the first item that the committee is bringing to the board, and let me just kind of stop here and thank the board so much for you all's patience with us. And I know we took some time doing this, and you were patient as the committee moved forward. So the first item that we're going to talk about and want you all to look at, which is in the report, is the disciplinary guidelines. And so as we look at the disciplinary guidelines, we are asking that you all look at them, and I'm sure you've already done that, and to start out by looking at, because there are 42 pages, so by looking at 1395.2, and we'll do it in kind of chunks or sections. And we would like to go through with them to see what, any comments, any changes, so we can start and give you a few minutes to do that. So we will start with 1395.2 and all the way to page 15 of the disciplinary guidelines, if you could kind of look through that and see what any changes, any comments. Yes.
Can I just say something right before that?
Please.
First of all, these are excellent. Y'all, your hard work is really reflected,
The
so.
committee, yes.
But I just would like, if it's all right, just say something about the introduction. It's
Yes.
just kind of the way something's worded, and I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm going to
No,
apologize.
please don't
You know
be-
how
don't
I go
apologize. Don't
weird
be
on this.
sorry.
It's line 194.
Okay.
And it says, this is particularly true in any case of client sexual abuse or sexual misconduct. It makes it sound like the client has committed sexual misconduct.
Say it again, Jack. I mean, Dr. Horn. 190.
194. This is particularly true in any case of client sexual abuse. That makes sense. or sexual misconduct, and that sounds like the client has committed the sexual misconduct?
So instead of saying something like, in any case of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct with a client.
Yes. Thank you.
And if I could ask Ms. Burns to go back,
Wait, can I get that? You want it with the client where?
At the end of the sentence?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
if I could ask Ms. Burns to go back to the regulation itself, not the language of the regulation that's excerpted in the disciplinary guidelines, but the regulation itself, which was before.
That's it.
Where we need to also change the date that the disciplinary guidelines are being updated on line 7 there. So in the disciplinary guidelines itself, it just says date board approves language, and so we would need to update that as well in the regulation itself. So be it today or be it at the next meeting, depending on.
What line is that on? I
It's-
can't see that far. sorry.
There we go. It's
Line 7.
line 7.
Oh, okay, sorry. Oh, I see. I went ahead of where you were.
Yes. Any other comments, Jackie? I mean, Dr. Moore?
Not for this part.
Not for this part. Okay. Any other comments from anyone else?
So we're on pages 3 to 15, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Starting at page, yes, 2, yes. Okay, hearing none,
Yours is
then,
Wait. I have, this is on page 11 and 81 of 502, and lines 493 and 494.
okay.
493, 494.
Yes.
So, well, first of all, on 494, I would change this to the decision. And you've done this several places along here. Some you put the decision and some you did this decision. But just to explain, when you say this decision, it's like you're making a quote. Is this how it's supposed to
Well,
be?
because it would be included in a decision. It
Right.
would be referring to it itself. But perhaps what you're saying is that we should be consistent in terms of how we do that in the guidelines?
I think you should, because of course it would be this, it would, when it's written in a decision, it would be this decision, but this is really about a guideline, so it's about the decision, right?
No, I think it would be a particular term and condition within that decision. So I think this decision, because it does mean the instant decision. So I
Okay,
think
so
this decision would be,
In other words, we want the administrative law judge to be able to take the guideline, fill in whatever information is necessary to the guideline,
Right.
and drop it into their decision.
Okay, so this actually is the quote you suggest to go into the decision.
Correct.
yes, this would
Yes.
be the actual language, the actual term as it's
Okay,
written
then-
in that disciplinary decision.
Then I think it should be so suggested or written. It just says listed below are optional terms and conditions that the board would expect. So if this is an actual quote, should it go in quotes? Should it say use this language? That's what I'm asking, because this is kind of throughout, so it's like you're saying, consider this or include this, but not, does that make sense? Or is it just I'm reading it weirdly and?
How does it read? I'm sorry, I
oh,
just want to ask
go
her,
ahead.
how does it read to you when you look at it?
When I'm reading it, it reads like, if you're going to put this decision, then it's a quote. You want this paragraph
That to
lifted
be
and put in the
into this.
decision. That's how I'm reading it. And if that's what you're doing, because elsewhere you do say things like, this is the paragraph or this is the wording to use. I
Well,
don't want to get hung up
there are
on this.
particular situations, I think, maybe I can respond to this, and maybe you can do a better job, Ms. Monterrubio, but there are situations in which we say, this is the mandatory language, it has to be
That's
included
right,
in the
that's
section.
right, yeah.
But the administrative law judge knows that the guidelines we're giving them the terms that they would include in the decision based on kind of the hierarchical list that we include, say, include items number 1, 7, and 9, or whatever.
Right, so the standard terms and conditions are conditions that you're going to see in every single proposed decision and stipulated settlement.
Yeah.
The optional ones are ones that we can consider using, but we use this exact language, and it's not just the ALJs, it's also the Deputy Attorney General's opposing counsel looks at these guidelines, so this exact language would be put in order. Typically, you shouldn't see language being modified by an administrative law judge or the AG's office.
So I think, Dr. Horn, what I think you are saying is potentially where it says listed below are optional terms and conditions, you want a reference to, and this is the language that can be used in an order. Because I think it would be very confusing to have quotation marks before the one and
Right.
quotation marks afterward, but I think what you're saying is potentially that explanation of this is the language of the term. I don't know that there's much confusion about that, but
There
Maybe
hasn't.
it was just my confusion.
Yeah.
And I read
There
it.
hasn't been confusion. I mean, with the orders that you are all seeing to vote on, it's this exact language. And we don't want different language in every order, so we want the ALJs to use what is here as well as the Deputy Attorney Generals, and it looks like they've been doing that. Hasn't been a problem.
Ms. Monterrubio, would it be correct to say that everyone within the system, whether the DAG, the enforcement person, or the administrative law judge, they all know that these are the terms that they include in the decision?
Yes.
So they wouldn't necessarily need the explanation?
I don't believe so.
Okay, that's fine, because then I was reading it correctly and just was confused, so. Okay, so then I have one more thing in these first 15 pages. And
then we're going back to this, then. Yes, leaving it like this.
so line 628, 629, practice, monitor, billing, monitor, worksite monitor. On line 628, clear and current license of at least 5 years duration. 2, you've crossed out have no. So it says current or former financial personal. You want to leave in have no.
Mm-hmm. Good catch.
Oh, yeah, an English teacher. In those first 15 pages.
May I have a quick question?
Yes, the first 15 pages, yes. Anything, before we get to your question, Jackie or Dr. Horn?
I'm done. Thank you.
Done? Thank you. Yes.
Just a quick question related to the thinking behind the committee shortening of the days for physical examination, which is 578, and the practice monitor, which is 624.
Which one?
Lines 578 and line 624. What was the discussion around shortening the 90 to 45 and 30 days respectively? Was that based on what we're seeing as the average times people are already doing that within those timelines, or is it because the 90 days period is too long? What's the thinking behind that?
Typically, people were able to meet those deadlines within the 45 days. Most times with a stipulated settlement, the respondent already knows what terms they're going to see in their owner once it's signed and adopted by the board. So let's say that they agree to these terms 30 days ago, but it doesn't get voted on by the board and adopted for another 45 days. They can already work to see who their practice monitor is going to be, set up a physical examination. So 45 days is enough time.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Pages from here. Now, thank you very much. Now we can move on. to
Dr.
page-
Winkleman, do you want to take public comment now, or?
I think it would be, well, while we're here
Okay.
at this particular
So,
juncture.
I'm sorry, Dr. Winkleman. Please come forward.
Is it public comment regarding this?
Yes.
Pages 3 to
piece?
15.
Yeah, pages 3 to
Yes.
2 to 50, yes. Very well.
Turn on your microphone. It's the face.
Okay. All right. Hi, Dr. Elizabeth Winklemuth, the California Psychological Association. I think I'm in the right place. I'm looking at lines 192 through 196 on the introduction part of the disciplinary guidelines and uniform standards related to substance abusing licensees. Am I in the right place here? Okay. So my question was just about in that paragraph, I think it has to, where it says that the board expects outright revocation or denial of the license. This is particularly true in any case of client sexual abuse or sexual misconduct. And I'm wondering, I think this is the same or similar issue to what's going to be discussed in 21D, where if you're adding, I would wonder about if sexual misconduct should be added as an automatic revocation, as opposed to having more flexibility in terms of that may be the appropriate thing to do in some cases, and in some cases, an automatic revocation of the license without any opportunity for probation or getting the license back may not be appropriate. So when I'm looking at 21D, which I know we'll discuss later, some examples of sexual behavior I think include hand-holding and excessive complimenting of the beauty of the person, which, for example, those might not be a good idea. They may, be inappropriate behaviors, but may not necessarily merit an automatic, definite revocation, permanent revocation of a person's license. So I would just request that you consider change to the language in that paragraph to not make that an automatic revocation of the license.
I might not be clear about this, but I think that when sexual misconduct is found, that's different from inappropriate sexual behavior. I think when the misconduct is found, at least that's how it's been in our enforcement cases that we've gotten. It's not the same as maybe crossing some boundaries. I don't want to say that's not inappropriate.
Exactly. I'm not saying that any of these are inappropriate, are appropriate. I'm saying that they may not merit automatic, definitive revocation of a person's license.
Right. So, but I think when in my experience, since I've been on the board, when a judge has found sexual misconduct, it's been misconduct, like revocable license misconduct.
Okay. The reason why I'm asking is because it looks like that the language has been added, and in this version that previously it said sexual abuse, and I'm just wondering if it's connected with the item that's going to be discussed in 21D, which is expanding what is proposed to be an automatic revocation of the license. So if sexual misconduct doesn't mean the same thing as sexual behavior as discussed in 21D, then I don't see a problem with it, but I didn't see, since I noticed this language was added and I didn't see a definition of what sexual misconduct is, that's why I wanted to raise the question.
I would have to wait until we're looking at that other section to make sure it's consistent, but I think this is a reference to any violations found under 2960.1 of sexual contact with a patient, because in that case, the statute says the revocation shall not be stayed by the ALJ. So in some cases, the ALJ does not have discretion, although the board does, and I think this is a reference to the fact that the ALJ may not have discretion in certain cases.
It's going to be awkward.
So, just to clarify, are you saying that sexual misconduct is defined in the code?
I think it is. I think that the section that Dr. Winkleman is talking about, I just don't have it in front of me, but I think, and we'll look at it later and make sure that this is consistent. What I am saying is that in some cases that involve sexual contact, the ALJ does not have the discretion, although the board does, and I think that's the reference to that. And I think it's more specific when the guidelines talk about the particular violations.
So,
So for example, let me see if I can find it.
I can wait and defer if you want. While you're looking, so this adding of sexual misconduct is for what's currently in the code already. It's not reflective of what we have in 2960.1, the amendments later on in the day. So it is the sexual misconduct when we're talking automatic revocation in 729, which is 728. Nope, 729. So it's going to be sexual contact and touching of an intimate part. So that is for what's already current law. So this does not, since these would be going forward right now, does not include any future legislative proposals encompassed within it. So.
Okay, thank you.
I can make maybe a brief comment that might clarify.
Mr. Tomplin?
So sexual misconduct, which is referenced here in the introduction, is a broad category of different types of sexual conduct. And within that, there's a very specific type that involves sexual contact. And under the law, if there's sexual contact, then the ALJ doesn't have discretion to do anything but revoke the license. So you're right that these terms are very specific. So I think what the introduction is saying is that it's encouraging, this isn't a required law, but it's encouraging for even the broad category beyond sexual conduct for strict discipline. But if we look just at the law itself, the specific term is sexual contact. If that's helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Any other comments? Oh, you want, Dr. Go ahead.
No. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Oh, no.
Chairperson.
Go right ahead.
I have just a
Yes.
clarifying question. So the psychological evaluation has been moved from optional to standard. Is that the only thing that changed, or is there anything else that was changed about
That was the only term that went from a optional term to a standard term.
But aside from that, everything about the psychological evaluation, it stays the same, aside from?
Yeah, you're still required to do that within the 90 days. Yes, I believe everything else stayed the same.
Thank you.
Sure.
Actually, I'm looking at the clock,
Oh,
so
you're- oh.
maybe we want to finish the comments on
Yes.
2 to 15, and then we'll
Yes.
break and go into closed
Okay.
session.
Are we done? Any other comments on section, our first section, 2 through 15, pages 2 through 59? We will,
Okay. Thank you very much. We will continue this discussion after we take our break. We're now going to go into closed session to discuss a pending case involving Ryokan College and some other disciplinary matters. That will take place from 10:30 till at least noon. What we may have to do, and we'll decide this as we go, we may have to, in order to complete that business as a board, we may have to work through lunch. We'll stop and get lunch, and people will have an opportunity to check out if they need to. But so at the earliest, we're going to reconvene at 1 p.m. For open session. So for any of you that are in the audience or a staff member who's not involved in the closed session, you can expect that you've now got some ample time to have lunch. You can probably get to Manhattan Beach and back if you want to. On foot. One. 1 o'clock, yeah. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, and we'll now go into closed session and reopen at 1. Oh, absolutely, yeah. It was read at one point. So we're back in session. We have visitors here from Sacramento, or a visitor here from Sacramento. So we're going to come back to the disciplinary guidelines, but right now we're going to item number 19, which is the overview of the role of the Office of the Attorney General. We're very happy to have Ms. Gloria DeCastro with us, as well as our own Josh Temple. We've co-opted him. Who are going to tell us more about the Attorney General's role in our enforcement process.
While Josh gets set up, I wanted to again express that it's our privilege to represent you on a daily basis statewide in front of Office of Administrative Hearings and on selected investigations that we assess your board in investigating. We meet on a quarterly basis with Ms. Sorick and Ms. Monterrubio on various topics, public policy issues, and efficiencies. And on the point of efficiencies, while we explain our administrative process, which is very focused on accusations, which are prosecutions, we want to express that we are your partner in all of the enforcement timelines and in the outcomes that you decide upon to discipline licensees. And it's a law firm at the Attorney General's office. It's called the Health Quality Enforcement Section. It's comprised of 70 attorneys in 5 different cities statewide. And we're subject matter experts in healthcare law. We're honored to be led by Javier Becerra, who I will advise you is very, very committed to healthcare, patient consumer rights, and just generally the protection of all consumers in the state of California. It's an exciting time to practice law at the Attorney General's office, and a privilege, like I said, to represent you on a daily basis.
Just a moment, we're going to load up our PowerPoint presentation.
While Josh does that, I wanted to point out a couple of things on enforcement timelines, which are always at the top focus of all of your board meetings, and these are these charts. And like I said, any time that time is spent either not notifying a consumer that an accusation is going to be filed is a lost opportunity. So we take it very seriously to be able to put the public on notice by filing accusations as quickly as possible. And after an accusation is filed, there are several actors involved in the timeline process. So even though the board does own the case from nose to tail, from the time a patient files a complaint to the time that you take the ultimate decision-making, the clients involved in processing those complaints, the Department of Investigation or the Health Quality Investigation Unit at DCA, they're in charge of investigating these complaints. Once the Attorney General receives the case, the Office of Administrative Hearings, and of course the licensee are all involved in the timeline process. Our liaison, Josh Temple, is an important and key actor in trying to reduce timelines as well. he provides some efficiencies to our statewide unit in the sense that because we have about 70 prosecutors and legal staff committed to your work, Josh will help us to be able to bring efficiencies to the process by advising us of new laws, new disciplinary guidelines, different interpretations statewide. I personally meet with Judge Alvord on a regular basis. Who's Judge Alvord? He's one of the presiding justices at the Office of Administrative Hearings. And when they hear our cases, we always bring your issues up to the forefront. We say, well, this is going to affect timelines, and can we do it a different way? Can we set this for hearing? This is a very important case. And ultimately, licensees. Licensees also own a part of this process in the sense that they are owed due process, and cases need to proceed at the pace that they need to proceed on. So it's my pleasure to introduce you, and you already know him, Mr. Joshua Tomplay. He's a Deputy Attorney General. He joined our office in San Francisco 5 years ago, and he has really been a valuable addition to our section. And I know that Ms. Sorek and Ms. Monterrubio really enjoy meeting with him, and I know that he's had the pleasure to work with each and every one of you. And again, I'm always available to come to any meeting and discuss anything with you. And Joshua keeps me very, very apprised of every single thing that is affecting your work, your constituencies, and your public policy. But without further ado, here's Josh.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, board members. I'm just going to give us a brief presentation today on what our office does for the disciplinary process. We've got a PowerPoint. Unfortunately, you might have to turn around to see the slides here. We just got 24 slides. I'll walk through pretty briefly. These are the sections we're going to cover today on the next slide, starting with the investigation, and we'll work through the prosecution process through to hearing. So let's turn to the next slide. As you all know, the Board of Psychology by law has a priority to protect the public. Next slide, please. And first, we'll just take a look at the investigation phase of that process. President Phillips mentioned this morning that the board has recently transitioned to a new investigative agency, the Division of Investigations, to handle most of its investigations. So the bulk of the cases are going to that agency. Typically, a complaint is received by the board. Board staff then review the complaints, sometimes with the help of an expert at that early stage. The board staff then refers the case for investigation to DOI, the Division of Investigation. And then in most cases, the board staff retain an expert to review the evidence that's gathered and opine on whether there's been unprofessional conduct. So again, effective, I believe it was 2016, DOI is doing most of the board's investigations. For those cases, though, that are vertically enforced, HQIU is the agency that does the investigation. All sex misconduct cases are vertically enforced, and the reason for that is about twofold. First, it's helpful to have an attorney present during the investigation of sex cases because it's important to assess the credibility of a complaining witness before making those, potentially career-ending allegations into a formal charging document. But second, also from a victim's rights perspective, we want to be sure that we carefully preserve the testimony of the victim. That is to get the full story the first time so that moving forward we have a strong case. So having an attorney involved early in that process can be very valuable. Sometimes other cases are also vertically enforced. This is on a case-by-case basis. And some factors that might drive that decision are if there's prior disciplinary history by a licensee, or if there's evidence that there's an immediate threat to the public. And you might want to have an attorney involved early to help expedite the process. Oh, yeah, please.
So on the cases that are handpicked and hand-selected for direction by Deputy Attorney General staff, who ultimately will be responsible for filing these charges and living with the case through the administrative process, the value that is added on those cases, in addition to the evidence gathering and obviously credibility determinations on these very high-priority cases, is that we're able to potentially file these cases much quicker, because it's a case that we have been familiarized with in the investigative module. So we believe that for those cases, again, because we want to put the public on notice that there's a potential issue with a licensee, we're able to file that accusation on a quicker clip. Later on, at the conclusion of Josh's presentation, we will go ahead and cover a little bit of an abridged report that I brought to you, but that's what vertical enforcement, pretty much the value that it brings to it. It's not good for every single case. There are cases that don't need it, but we firmly believe that there are high priority cases that are completely benefited by early involvement.
So let's return to the typical case, which is just not vertically enforced, and that's, in those cases, the Attorney General's office only gets involved after the investigation is complete. So turning to the next slide here, referral to the Attorney General's office. Can you switch it? Thanks. Let me just see here. So in those cases where an expert reviewer has found unprofessional conduct, the case is referred to our office. We also get referred cases directly from board staff where an expert opinion wasn't needed. Those are simpler cases or maybe criminal conviction cases. Board staff will just directly transmit those to our office for prosecution. The State Attorney General's office has a section of attorneys who prosecute misconduct of health professionals, and that's our section, the Health Quality Enforcement section. The attorneys there are called DAGs, Deputy Attorneys General, that's me, and we act as the board's prosecutor. And as Ms. Castro pointed out to me, our section is actually the only section at the Attorney General's office that has a mandate to serve specific clients, and the board is one of our clients. Who are DAGs? By the way, DAGs are experienced trial attorneys, but for the most part, we don't have formal psychological training. It probably doesn't come as a surprise to you. We're just attorneys, most of us, unlike your president. And we do rely heavily on experts to inform us on the practice of psychology, what it means, and whether there's weaknesses or strengths in certain cases. We really do need the help of a trained expert to assess that. Let me just give you a quick example on the next slide of a path of an investigation before it gets to our office. So a quick hypothetical case. Let's say a patient files a complaint with the board about her psychotherapist. According to the patient, her therapist routinely welcomed a personal friend of his to sit in on her psychotherapy treatment sessions. During the therapy sessions, the therapist's friend made regularly disruptive comments and observations, right? So very clear multiple violations there if the complaint is true. So the board receives that complaint. The staff screen it, and the case is referred to the Investigation and Enforcement Unit, the DOI investigator. Either board staff or the assigned investigator will obtain the patient's records by subpoena if necessary, interview witnesses, including the patient and, if possible, this personal friend of the psychologist. And last, the assigned investigator will interview the subject psychologist. Because this case isn't particularly complicated, likely will not be vertically enforced, so no attorney will be present at the subject interview. Our office would only get involved after the investigation. So the evidence obtained will be provided to an expert who will provide an opinion as to whether the licensee departed from the standard of practice or otherwise engaged in unprofessional conduct. If the expert does find unprofessional conduct, at that point, the investigation comes to our office for prosecution. Okay. Oh, we've got a handout that details this in clarity. It's an immense flow chart, but it will actually lead you through the whole process. If you'd like to follow along on that, feel free. Oh, that's right. And for the public, we have copies of the two handouts we provided to the board available at the handout section. On the next slide, I want to talk about how our office evaluates cases for prosecution. We need two things to prosecute a case. We need sufficient facts, and we need an expert opinion. So in order to file disciplinary charges against the licensee, we've got to be sure that we have enough facts and that we've got a sufficient expert opinion to allow us to articulate a cause for discipline. Our review includes an assessment of patient records, witness statements, and expert opinion. In complex cases, it may be necessary for the DAG to consult with an expert in order to ensure that they understand the issues correctly before we actually write our charging document. Most important here, we've got to make sure we meet our burden, and I think as I noted earlier, we have to be able to satisfy ourselves that we can prove these charges by clear and convincing evidence to a reasonable certainty. And I think the next slide shows really what a significant burden that is. This just shows the 3 different levels of proof used in law, the most common ones. And those percentages are arbitrary. They don't really mean much. But as you can see, we're not held to quite a high standard as criminal courts, where one's potential life is in jeopardy. But here, clear and convincing evidence is quite high. It's higher than the standard found in normal civil court.
And part of the reasoning behind that, found in case law, is fairly simple. As Mr. Tomplay just pointed out, it's beyond a reasonable doubt when your liberty is at stake. However, when your license is at stake, that is a property right. Therefore, it must be a higher burden of proof than preponderance of the evidence. The government is taking away your property right and ability to fulfill what for many of us has been your life mission. You went to school, you put in a lot of hours, and this is a property right that you have in your license. And even though it's a privilege, that's why that burden is that high. At the same time, because the Attorney General is an independent actor, we have to make sure that it meets our standards, and we really work with our clients to be able to obtain the evidence to make a case be filed, and if not, then it's not. We absolutely try to avoid having withdrawals of accusations, but from time to time that occurs. If the evidence is no longer there after discovery and a battle of experts has pretty much materialized in the middle of a trial, we will withdraw accusations. At the same time, we don't like to lose, and I'm happy to report we win most of our cases. We have very few dismissals, but from time to time, an ALJ, an administrative law judge, who is also an independent actor, will recommend dismissal of an accusation outright, and that means that the government did not prove any part of its case.
Turning to the next slide, the filing of the accusation, and on the next slide, we'll get into a little more detail. So if we do find that there is sufficient evidence to establish a violation of law, cause for discipline, the DAG will draft an accusation, and that's the document that you've all seen before that notifies the licensee of the charges against him or her. When the accusation has been reviewed and signed by the executive officer, a copy is sent to the subject psychologist and published online on Breeze. Unless the psychologist chooses not to contest the charges, he or she will request a hearing on the charges, and that's, of course, scheduled by the Office of Administrative Hearings. Before we get to hearings, I'll just turn to the next slide just to give you a few quick examples of the types of misconduct that we prosecute. I think you're all familiar with these, but I'll just quickly run through this list here. Probably the most common category are just general quality of care cases. This is a catch-all category where an expert has found some departure from the standard of practice. It can include, any of these other categories, really. It's a catch-all category. Sexual misconduct cases, again, that can be both another departure from the standard of practice, or it can also be charged under the board's specific sexual misconduct statutes. Multiple role relationship and boundaries violation cases. I'll just skip through a few of these here. Violations of the APA Code of Conduct. The board has incorporated the APA Code into its standard of practice, so we can charge any part of the APA Code of Conduct. A violation of that constitutes grounds for discipline for the board. The board also has a few of its own rules of professional conduct and its regulations. We can charge those. And then there's another even broader category here of general unprofessional conduct. Conduct that indicates an unfitness to practice that isn't necessarily covered specifically by other statutes. For example, sexual harassment of a non-patient, or cruelty to animals, just sort of general categories that indicate problems that aren't captured by a specific law. The last category, incompetence, that's just a lack of knowledge or ability in carrying out your professional obligations. That overlaps quite a bit with departures. Sometimes it's not clear if it's a willful act or just not knowing the correct body of knowledge that has caused something harm to happen. And I'll just turn quickly to the next slide. These are just examples of cases that we usually don't need an expert opinion to prosecute. So these are cases that the board can investigate sometimes all by itself or maybe with the help of an investigator. No expert is needed, and then it's sent directly to our office. So conviction of a crime, these are typically simple cases because we're just talking about whether or not someone was convicted. And you can show that with just a piece of paper. Dishonesty or fraud, not necessarily needed to have an expert opinion talk about why it's unprofessional conduct for a psychologist to engage in fraud or dishonesty. And some other simple cases here are mentioned. So on our way to hearing next, I'll talk about discovery and settlement. Discovery, briefly, is just the process where we exchange information with the charged licensee and his or her attorney. It's an opportunity for our office to gather mitigating evidence, information we hadn't been aware of that might cause the board to consider a more lenient discipline in the end. Turning to settlement, the DAG will assess her ability to prove the charges in the accusation based on what we learned during discovery. Maybe there's weaknesses we didn't know about before. Maybe the case is more egregious than we thought. The DAG will discuss the case with the assigned board analyst, and we'll talk about in a bit, we'll refer to the board's guidelines to make a recommendation for settlement. Settlement will, of course, include recovery of the costs of investigation and prosecution. And if a settlement agreement is reached, the DAG will send the board a recommendation to adopt the settlement. Turning to the next slide, I think you're all aware of the range of discipline in cases, from a public reproval to revocation of a license. And of course, the board's guidelines really provide a lot of detail there in talking about what sort of terms are appropriate in those cases that fall short of a revocation. So what length of probation, what specific terms, and what optional terms that the prosecutor should consider. And next here, we'll talk about hearings. After filing of an accusation, unless the psychologist chooses not to contest the charges, she will request a hearing. The Office of Administrative Hearings handles this, and it's held before an administrative law judge, an ALJ. Hearings can be as short as just a few hours. Usually they're about 2 or 3 days, and the most complex ones can take weeks. Maybe 2 weeks is probably the most common long hearing. So our goal at hearing as the prosecutor is to prove to the ALJ that there is clear and convincing evidence of unprofessional conduct. Hearings typically require a lot of preparation by the DAG. We've got to schedule witness preparation, draft and rehearse their testimony, file and respond to motions. It's quite a bit of work that goes up to the actual hearing. And I think Ms. Castro would like to say something.
And so oftentimes, it's not surprising to anyone in this room, our hearings tend to be battle of the experts. While it's not required to obtain expert reports at discovery, it's very useful when respondents do, in fact, provide us with what their expert may say at trial. It really does help the process and our assessment of it. At the same time, this is one of the parts of the enforcement timeline that can have some friction. The Office of Administrative Hearings is responsible for a general jurisdiction calendar as well as a specified jurisdiction calendar, and you're one of those clients. At the same time, because they have a limited amount of judges that actually know healthcare law, sometimes OAH will try to schedule those judges to hear your cases. That's a good thing. At the same time, it can delay the process. I know that the Office of Administrative Hearings endeavors to set hearings as quickly as possible. The San Francisco office happens to be one of those jurisdictions that will set it within, what, 180 days, Josh?
150 days.
150 days. But statewide, that's not, that. While the San Francisco, Oakland area will set those hearings within 150 days of our request for a hearing, other parts of the state do not enjoy that quick setting. So it's always, like I said, useful to be able to meet with Office of Administrative Hearings, point out those friction points, and try to convince judges to set our cases quicker. It's very interesting to be able to talk to the judges because we all believe our case is the most important, and I think every single client feels that their cases are very important. But again, we try to give a very realistic amount of days that we need to try the hearing and secure that date as quickly as possible. Because you are a board that collects prosecution costs, I believe that this is very useful in settlement. Because the longer it takes to adjudicate the case, the more costs we're potentially going to collect in a settlement posture. And even though it's up to our EO to decide how many costs we're going to collect, that bill continues to go up. So it's a good thing that you collect costs.
Okay, turning to what happens after the hearing. The next slide here. So at the hearing, the ALJ hears the evidence for and against the subject psychologist, and based on the evidence, she writes a proposed decisions. And that proposed decision, as I'm sure you've seen, is submitted to you, the board, for adoption as its final decision. If the board adopts the proposed decision, it becomes final. If it does not, there are a few options for the board. The board can have a transcript of the hearing prepared and can decide the case itself. And that's based on the administrative record, no witnesses. The board can send the case back to the ALJ with instructions for further proceedings, or the board can adopt the decision with certain minor modifications. Turning to what happens, what can happen after the decision, post-decision, the subject psychologist could petition the board for reconsideration of the decision if it's not final, if it has not yet become effective. If the board does receive that kind of petition, it can reach out and request a written response from the prosecutor on behalf of the board's executive officer responding to the request for reconsideration. The subject psychologist can also file a writ in Superior Court asking that court to review the decision of the board. And those petitions are based, again, on an administrative record, so there's no live witnesses. If there's a writ proceeding, a writ challenge filed, the prosecutor will continue to represent the board's executive officer in Superior Court. Just a few examples of what those sort of writs can be based on if it's alleged that the findings in a decision are not supported by the evidence, or if it's alleged that the decision's outcome or the discipline imposed is not supported by the findings. Those are the sort of bases that would allow a Superior Court to overrule the board. Very rarely a case will be appealed by an extraordinary writ to a court of appeal. If that should happen, again, HQE will continue to represent the executive officer in appellate court. Okay, we're going to accept questions at this point. Comments?
There we go. Are there any questions from board members?
I had a quick question. You had mentioned that you do consider prior disciplines, correct? How long does that stay on record with you?
Well, at least informally, I've seen cases 10 years back where we still see that the board had, for example, put someone on probation for 5 years. Breeze, I don't know how long Breeze keeps the history posted. Do you know offhand?
I do not know how long the board maintains those records, but I'm happy to say that once we got pro law in, I think, 2000, the AG's office definitely sees what the prior discipline is. And to the extent that we've retained documents, we'll consider that prior discipline. Sometimes it's not the same topic. It's more relevant where they have prior discipline and it's on the same topic. It's relevant to a prosecutor because if you already, for example, gave this person probation 5 years ago and they come yet again before you with the same issue, obviously the rehabilitation did not take effect. One bonus of having your own law firm at the Attorney General's office and having a staff actually that is very committed to our work. We have very rarely vacancies other than for retirement. People that come to HQE don't leave. We will gift the DAG that handled the prior discipline with the new case, and they'll remember the licensee. So that is why we do see a prior disciplinary history as relevant in how we're going to treat the case. And the client can always vertically enforce that case as well. And I defer to Ms. Monterrubio.
Prior discipline stays on the licensing history indefinitely, and whenever we transmit cases over to the AG's office, we let them know that there is prior discipline, even if it was 10, 15 years ago, and we can provide those documents to them as well.
I had one question. You mentioned that you had a very high, you had a very high success rate in terms of the hearings once a decision's made to move forward. I take it part of the reason for that high success rate is you feel like you thoroughly vet whether you'd be able to satisfy the standard?
That's correct. When necessary, we do liaise back with our EO and our enforcement folks back at the client agency and make recommendations for further investigation. There might be little things that will make this case stronger and able to meet that high burden. It can be as simple as certification of records or one more interview of some witness that maybe saw the whole thing, just a psychological assistant or someone who had been in the office who is aware of other facts in the case. Oftentimes, because we do exact these standards, we will get discipline. And the part of the materials that I provided to you actually do track how many cases we have filed and withdrawn. For this particular board, and this is page 36 of the abridged SB 467 report that I passed out to you, we withdrew two cases out of in the 30s is okay. Withdrawals also happen when unfortunately people become deceased and they expire, so their case expires with them, obviously. But these are cases that we, after discovery and after the battle of the experts has been fleshed out, then we withdraw because we no longer meet that burden. In terms of dismissals, that happens as well. That's not tracked on this report, but it's a very good percentage, and we do get discipline on your cases. And we firmly believe that the vertical enforcement process assists in that, as well as the other cases that don't require vertical enforcement that we highly vet. These numbers right here actually represent the table 2. All those metrics are 50-50. So 50% of the case counts in Table 2 were vertically enforced as investigations, and 50% were not. So these are one of the boards that will spend a little extra money and extra hours to get that case filed. And sometimes you do know which case is going to require that. Interim suspension orders are a specific type of case where as soon as it comes in the door, it's very evident that there are practice issues that are either putting the patient or the public at risk, either mentally unbalanced or physically ailing licensees working past their prime, anywhere up to someone who is having sex with patients and is an utter danger to the public.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I think maybe you started to answer some of my question. I know earlier today we had a great presentation by staff. Ms. Monterrubio explained and shared with us make sure I'm calling it the right way, the complaint prioritization and referral guidelines. And I know that's a DCA document from what I can see. Do you all do any prioritization and have any kind of tool that you then look at the cases once they get referred to you? Or who gets referred from us, rather?
That's right. No, we're very familiar with the complaint prioritization guidelines. Although we were not involved in the setting of any of those standards, we are very aware. And by we, I also include the licensing section. That's my counterpart that represents about 32 other DCA clients, most of them non-health boards. We're healthcare exclusive. The complaint prioritization is highly relevant, and also, some clients have their own prioritization statutes on top of that. So if there are cases that you want us to prioritize, believe me, your EO and Ms. Monterrubio make us aware of that. Josh started to kind of touch upon those cases, sex cases, prior disciplinary history, high danger to the public, incompetence, people practicing outside their scope of qualifications and training and experience. At the same time, what came out of those complaint prioritization guidelines was kind of a number, 540 days from nose to tail. once we begin having more discussions with DCA, the Attorney General's office, and hopefully the Office of Administrative Hearings, we hope to be able to get a more realistic standards for complex cases. 540 days may be good for a case of low complexity. I submit to this board and to the public that none of your cases are easy. They're all complex. They all involve high stakes, highly personal details, and very public safety issues generally, because most of the time these psychologists don't only have one patient, although we have seen that in the past. But most of them have a very large patient population. So, yeah, we're your partners in that, and so are the folks at the Department of Investigation and Health Quality Investigation Unit. When we see a case come across our desks, we don't wait for someone to tell us it's a priority. We can tell.
Any more questions from the board? Do we have any public comments or questions? Ma'am?
Yes, hi.
You need to come forward, use the microphone.
Hi, wonderful to see everybody here. I hope you understand my English. I speak 5 languages. I can always switch. I have been in touch with this industry for about 5 months or 6 months more precisely. So I'm pretty new to it, but I have spent pretty much every single night reading about it. I'm an international journalist caught in a custody battle in Northern California, although I live in Los Angeles. And I have been forced to an evaluator. I tried to understand the reason why that was different, and I've read specifically, I actually have a psychology studies in Europe, and I struggle to understand the difference between a court-appointed psychologist and how does he get vetted by the industry, and he is absolutely imposed by the court. And I always look at preventing the problem before it becomes a problem. And I see, and it strikes me how there is absolutely no regulation, no oversight, and a parent in the system has absolutely no power to go to the Board of Psychology, to the Department of Consumer Affairs, and have a timely resolution to violation of clear rules, including the rules of the court, the American APA rules. Psychologists themselves say that they do not belong to APA, therefore, they don't have to subscribe to those rules. Judges don't seem to be aware of the entire rules and the code of conduct that's imposed to the psychologists, and yet they vet their own specific evaluation, rather it is the AG, rather it is the Government Accountability Office that oversees how those evaluators get vetted and how do they actually get in their custody recommendation before the problems become to such extent that it takes 150 days for somebody to even decide if they're going to pursue an investigation. I see more and more complete unaccountability on their side, and I had a very brief conversation with my evaluator. He resigned from my case because he thought I was a little bit too scary. I am completely in awe of how complete disrespect of the own rules of the court, it's continued in the industry. And he basically told me out loud, oh, the Board of Psychology will not do absolutely anything. They have never reprimanded me. I've been doing this for 20 years. And I sense a God complex in my evaluator. And I know about 10 other parents that have lost their children to this exact same evaluator. And I've read the confidential reports, which you're not allowed to expose. And I have seen in action a man that has an absolute power and absolute no accountability whatsoever. And I find that disturbing, and I think that it's wonderful that you are all getting together here to vet those evaluators before they are appointed by the court. No qualifications were disclosed. My complaint about, and actually he was missing the absolute mandatory domestic violence, although the court makes a rule of that, they do not whatsoever verify whether that exists or not. When you ask an evaluator to submit to the rules, he specifically tells you, the court vetted me already. You go to the court, you try to get the public records on his qualification. They don't exist. They're not being provided to the public. So basically, they have no accountability. You ask them point blank, excuse me, can you please provide me the information of your qualification and your mandatory domestic violence trainings? And they tell you, I don't need those. The court already appointed me. I'm the only evaluator appointed. I find it disturbing, again, that nobody will actually look if there is a qualification. That's one matter. Another matter, relationship, multiple relationship. When multiple relationships are clearly stated on internet, and we live in an area where everything is searchable, when you are able to see on LinkedIn the connection of those evaluators with the wealthy fathers in the custody battles, and you point that out to the court, that gets absolute nobody cares. Oh, but it's washed under the water. Oh, it's just irrelevant. It's she said. We can trust the internet. I find that extremely worrisome, because those numbers and the fact that those evaluators also work with other companies, and there is clear conflict. I'm sorry, I will be short.
If you could conclude your remarks.
Yes, I apologize for that.
Because we've been limiting people to 5
But
minutes.
so the oversight, the lack of oversight of those evaluators before they get to the point where they destroy the lives of people, the inability to recover after those lives are being already destroyed, it is pretty big, and the God complex of those evaluators. I wonder, does anybody evaluate those evaluators? And that is my question to the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if that's a topic in particular that either of you would be in a position to respond to.
What I will share with the board is that you do have a history of issuing discipline specific to child custody evaluator cases, either referred directly from courts or filed by usually the non-custodial parent who has been, at the short end of the evaluation. And so following the Department of Consumer Affairs Census review hearing, we looked into the issue ourselves to see, well, do we try these cases? And so I've shared that, I'll share that here, that you do have a history of having issued discipline. It runs all over, and it's very case specific. Obviously, we don't have precedential decisions for any of our boards. Each case is weighed on its own merits with its own experts and with its own fact-intensive witness testimony and expert testimony as well. But it is an issue that we would be experienced to be able to litigate on your behalf. Forensic experts, such as workman's comp, this is a common issue across all boards. There are different folks that exist for different reasons, and this is a forensic sort of relationship that is necessary in the administration of justice on family law matters.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Ms. Russell? That we try to speak specifically to the topic of this presentation.
Exactly. That's what I plan to do. Thank you. Deputy Temple mentioned simple cases, those involving conviction of a crime, dishonesty or fraud, discipline by another state. And I just wanted to ask if that was a different timeline, if something is accepted at the AG's office as a simple case. Are those handled more quickly or not? And the other question is, I think for the AG's office and maybe the board collectively, but I'd like to know why revocations of licenses are so rare, because I've looked at your data and it's extremely rare, and even some pretty egregious behavior ends up with the licensees getting their licenses back within 5 years after probation. So would love to know the rationale behind that. Thanks.
I can assist to answer the first question. The use of the word simple just relates to the fact that we don't need an expert to tell us if it's a legal opinion that is going to make or break a filing determination. Those types of cases can involve dishonesty and fraud, sometimes even outright incompetence, just like they took a bunch of money and never performed services. That's not hard to assess. I don't have the data But I know that these types of cases can and do have a shorter course as desk investigations at the client agency. Some of those cases are not sent to the field for investigation by a sworn investigator. And when they are referred to us, such as in the case of convictions of a crime, crimes that are substantially related to the qualifications, functions, and duties of the profession, it's a legal call, and one that I think our talented attorneys are able to make a case for, that it is related, that it is substantial relatedness, and that it does affect the qualifications, or actually not the qualifications, but the ability of this practitioner to continue to practice without either oversight by this board or outright revocation. On the issue of revocation of cases, I do not have those statistics in front of me on how often revocations or surrenders take place, but those are outcomes, obviously, in our cases. At the same time, remember when I mentioned the property right and all the licensees do not lose their licenses forever and ever. They do have an ability to petition for reinstatement. If the equities lie in their favor, then they have their licenses returned. While our presentation was not focused on all the other things that we do for your office, like statement of issues cases, civil cases when you get sued, we're your lawyers, petitions for reinstatement and petitions for early termination or probation lie in equity. In both of those matters, we actually represent the public. So even though you pay us to be responsive to that petition, where the petitioner bears the burden of proving to the public that they're ready to come back into the fold and as a licensee in good standing before your eyes, we represent the public in those situations. And oftentimes our staff will fight very valiantly to prevent that person from coming back. And if they come back reinstated, that they come back with probationary conditions. At the same time, the Office of Administrative Hearings is an independent actor as well, and they have their own views on where the equities may rest. But again, it is a property right that can be returned. It's not uncommon, though, to see, at least in my experience, and I've been at the Attorney General's office for almost 25 years, most of my time spent in the health quality enforcement section. There are situations where people repeatedly request their license back and they don't get it back. Those types of cases usually involve sex offenders or people with very, very grave crimes for which they have been convicted and incarcerated. Those are the right calls, obviously. And with the help of the Office of Administrative Hearing, those folks are basically told exactly what they need to do. They need to rehabilitate, they need to acknowledge their acts and point out why they're ready to come back. So I hope that answers some of the question on the revocation of licenses. But I don't have the data, but of course the board does.
This board hears petitions directly. Ms. Castro or Mr. Tom Clay, could you explain what the Topanga case ruling means in terms of revocations or just decisions related to the disciplinary cases that come before the board in general, and how that sort of guides the path for that? Or maybe that's a question for Ms. Marks.
I don't think I was quite clear on the beginning of the question.
The Topanga case?
I believe is Topanga related to boards and voting and...
No, Topanga is related to the analytical framework.
That's right.
That must be shown, demonstrated in any of the decisions issued by the board. It essentially says that the decision must show, as we like to say, show your work, show how you got to the end result. So as we sometimes discuss with a particular case when you're deciding whether to adopt it, does the evidence support the factual findings, and do the factual findings support the legal conclusions? And I would imagine that the Office of the Attorney General certainly takes that into account when you're making your arguments and setting forth the evidence that they're admitting into that they're asking to have admitted. Does that support the factual findings of whether or not there's misconduct, and whether that supports a legal conclusion, that the particular sections of the code were violated. Does that help?
Yes, and so that oftentimes does not present itself at the administrative hearing level. We put forth the evidence that we believe support every single line in that accusation. Those are, just the different causes for discipline. The issue does come up on writs, and it can be tried all the way up to the Court of Appeal. We had a recent case, I believe it was Sapienza, I might be mistaken, but basically that's all that an independent person, once you get to the Superior Court level, they independently look to see if you have built that house on a solid framework, and that if your conclusions are, like she said, built upon factual findings, and those findings were based on proper weight being assigned to credibility of witnesses, and that it's just proper. So yes, but it comes up in the writ. Anything to add on that, Josh?
Really quickly, Ms. Castro, if you can, in response also to the public comment, can you speak to your office's involvement in negotiating surrenders of a license as well?
It would be our pleasure, and Josh can certainly jump in as well. Negotiating surrenders is an important facet of our work. We do provide discovery as early as possible to opposing counsel. Many of your licensees are represented by counsel, so that assists in convincing respondents that surrender would be a good option for them. The quicker they surrender, the quicker those years pass, and the quicker they can get to a petition for reinstatement. The board really determines whether to accept the surrender. Obviously, they should, in most cases, accept a surrender. We formulate a legal pleading for you to consider, and it's very quick. Surrenders are ripe in cases where there will be no rehabilitation or probation coming from this board. Your disciplinary guidelines make that very clear. What those types of cases are that are just not going to be poised for anybody to be able to, rehabilitate this licensee. Anything to add, Josh?
No, I think that's great. Surrenders are a very useful tool for efficiently meeting a goal that I think is in both sides' interest, where it's clear that a license is going to be revoked, the case proceeds to hearing, and where both parties are having an open dialogue and sort of proceeding rationally. It's just an ideal circumstances to accept a surrender. I think it's in everyone's interest in those more serious cases.
On the agenda, this agenda item? Hearing none and seeing that the board doesn't appear to have any further comment, we'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you, once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to return to the subject of the disciplinary guidelines. Last I recall, I think we'd gone through page 2 through 15. Do you want to turn your microphone on? Not that I'm one to talk.
Turn it on. Okay. Yes, now may we please look at pages 16 through 30. 16 through 30. For review. Through 30, yes. Okay. Any comments, questions, corrections? Hearing none, seeing none. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Did we give you time enough to get? Great. Yes.
On page, excuse me, page 17, lines 763, 764. I think this is fine. I think the way it's written is fine. And this kind of may be a function of sometimes some of the cases we've heard, but we're saying appropriately refer or terminate existing clients or patients, which I think is definitely, obviously appropriate, and that it has to happen within a certain amount of time, which I also think is appropriate. Never mind, I'm going to skip that. So I think it's a kind of a larger issue. I don't want to necessarily get into it. Page 18. Okay. I was looking at 793 and 794, and it's like immediately cease practice, but then you still have the 30 days. So basically, what does that mean? Within the next 30 days, the clients who are being seen by the psychologist will be, I mean, the psychologist will like meet with them and refer them out and have referrals for them. 793 and 794. This is the respondent has to immediately cease practice on, this is option 1, if about passing an examination. If the respondent fails to take or fails such examination, the board shall order the respondent to cease practice, and upon such order, respondent shall immediately cease practice. Clearly refrain from accepting people new, but then you also have these current people who are, the psychologist still has current people who are in his or her practice. And partly I'm asking about that. Person has 30 days to make sure that they're appropriately referred on, but that doesn't mean the psychologist won't see them in that 30 days. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to make this more complicated than this is, but I'm looking at the welfare of these current clients. So.
The way the language had been written before, it was not, in some cases, entirely clear that what the procedure was supposed to be. So we wanted to make it clear that termination needed to take place. That within the appropriate standards, which would include referral, that take place, but that they had 30 days within which to accomplish that. And, you know, in an ideal situation, sometimes when you terminate a patient, you would give a much longer period of time than that. But these are people that have been deemed unsafe to practice for one reason or another.
Right.
So we want them to wrap it up quickly.
Yeah. So in that process of ceasing practice, it's essentially you've got 30 days to stop practicing, take care of the people that you're already seeing. So,
And in the meantime,
I
take
mean,
new
that'll
patients.
be jolting, and don't take anybody new. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Ms. Matu, would you like to comment on this? Thank you. Thank you.
To how far are we going?
Page 30.
Page 30.
Okay. We're looking
Sorry.
16 through 30 now.
Okay. Line 181, and this is just a little.
181?
181.
I mean, 1181, sorry.
1181.
1181. So on line 1180, we talked about respondent. 1181, we're talking about communicating with their employer. Respondent is singular. There is plural. So Could we say the employer, supervisor, or where contracted?
Well, they're typically, because we've gone through discussion.
Exactly
Prolonged
this,
discussion.
yes.
We're trying, is that gonna go? I must have knocked it wrong. We do not, we're trying to be as gender neutral as possible.
Understood.
Because even his or her doesn't
Then
necessarily.
can we make respondent, respondents?
Well, I was gonna say, that's what we've been doing, is pluralizing
Okay.
respondent.
That's fine,
So perhaps we want to do that here?
yeah.
No?
No, because this is the language that goes in the order, and you would only have one respondent.
Well, then, could we say the employer, supervisor, or where? I mean, again, I get our being gender neutral. I completely understand that and agree with it. Or could we say his or her or their, depending on the person? All right, yeah. Never mind. I'm just
Yeah,
I mean,
I suppose that could be an option if the parties are
Respective.
aware of it, whether or not the respondent prefers a particular pronoun.
how about with the respective, as Dr. Kashuga said?
Her microphone's not working.
Mine?
Oh, that's what, oh, okay.
Kashuga.
What about respondents, possessive?
Well, that's what I said first, but then Ms. Marks said we couldn't do that because this is about one particular
No,
respondent.
I think Ms. Zurich said the possessive, so to communicate with respondent's employer.
Oh, respondents,
Repeat.
yeah,
To
fine.
communicate with
Apostrophe S.
respondent, apostrophe S.
Fine,
Respondent's employer.
totally fine. I know there's argument about it, but, yeah.
For some of us, it looks good.
Yeah. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Not according to Word, I just did it in the Word, and it's not, I think there is debate about the different standard because people have gone to that, so.
Right.
The big question.
Respondent apostrophe.
Sounds like we've got it resolved.
No wonder they can't. Public comment for pages 16 through 30? Okay, thank you, not. And now we will move on to pages 31 through 42. 31 through 42.